Agnes's birthday dinner. Baked snails and butter, lemon and parsley, breast of duck, and a creme de cassis sauce. Chartreuse of vegetables, strawberry mousse, chinoise, and raspberry tart. We had decided on a menu of duck breast and a creme de cassis sauce, served with a chartreuse of vegetables and an appetizer of snails and a lemon, garlic, and parsley butter. To begin the chartreuse, I peeled about 5 pounds of red potatoes, which I boiled in lightly salted water. While the potatoes were cooking, I julienned and parboiled 5 or 6 medium-sized carrots, along with thin slices of summer squash and zucchinis, 2 of each, a half dozen Brussels sprouts, a couple of florets of cauliflower, 6 cabbage leaves, and about 1.5 pounds of string beans. Since I hadn't found fresh peas, I substituted a bag of frozen. It's important that all the vegetables, with the exception of the peas, be slightly cooked and cooled before the construction begins. When the potatoes had boiled long enough, I drained them, added a cup of creme fraiche, 4 tablespoons of chopped roasted garlic, a 1/4 cup of butter, salt and pepper, and mashed them until they were smooth. Then I set them aside to cool. When this was done, I took a souffle dish, slathering the bottom and sides with enough butter, at least 1/4 pound, to hold the cooled vegetables when pressed into it. Next, I laid a ring of peas around the bottom of the dish, followed by a ring of overlapping zucchini slices, then an overlapping ring of summer squash, alternating in this fashion until the bottom of the dish was covered. Around the sides, I alternated the julienne carrot sticks with the string beans. Next, adding the mashed potatoes, I carefully covered the bottom so as not to disturb the design, pushing more up against the sides like a plaster to hold the carrots and string beans in place. The potatoes should be at least 2 inches thick, creating a well in the center to be lined neatly with 2 of the cabbage leaves, pressed firmly into the potatoes. Into this well, I laid a ring of Brussels sprouts with the cauliflower at the center, then covered it over with another cabbage leaf, covered that with more potatoes and another double ring of squash and zucchini, finally covering it all with the remaining potatoes. I used a pair of scissors to trim off any of the carrots and string beans sticking out over the top of the dish. By 5:30, the others had returned from tours, and while they were dressing for dinner, I began preparing the duck. In a small saucepan, I put 3 cups of creme de cassis, 2 large shallots chopped, a half cup of a strong Dijon mustard, and the juice and zest of 1 orange. I brought the mixture to a light simmer, eventually reducing it by half, which left a thick, deep purple syrup. Setting this to the side, I placed the 4 duck breasts onto a cooking rack over a sheet pan and put them into a 350-degree Fahrenheit oven to cook slowly, reducing the shrinkage and leaving them just slightly on the pink side. This took about half an hour. I removed the duck, turned the heat up to 425 degrees, and placed the chartreuse in the oven for 20 minutes. I prepared the snails with a simple filling of butter, lemon, parsley, garlic, salt, and pepper, and placed them on a small baking sheet ready for the broiler. I cut each duck breast into thin slices and laid them into a terracotta baking dish. I poured off the fat from the baking pan, added the duck juices to the cassis mixture, letting it simmer for a few more minutes, then poured it over the duck and placed the baking dish back in the oven for a few minutes. Meantime, Mackie and Rory lit the candles and set the table, which Letty and Mona had decorated with a dozen bright little bouquets from the garden using the creme caramel jars that Mona had salvaged for vases. We all donned our wreaths and shouted surprise when Agnes appeared. Her mother placed a crown of green leaves and yellow flowers on her head and took her in her arms, not unlike the way she had so many times before. Agnes looked lovely, flushed with surprise, her beautiful blonde hair freshly brushed and hanging loose about her shoulders, a broad, slightly embarrassed smile crossing her face. We lifted glasses of champagne in her honor, and as everyone took their places in anticipation of the banquet, I brought on the first course of snails. When we had finished them, Jack and Mackie cleared away the dishes while I removed the chartreuse from the oven, covered it with a platter, inverted it, and carefully lifted the souffle dish. The result was a beautiful piece of freestanding edible sculpture. As everyone applauded this success, I proudly set the duck before Agnes. I felt that I had reached a summit with this meal, one of the few times in 30 years of cooking that I felt completely gratified with my own creation. The sauce was one of the best of my career, a perfect blend of ingredients that was an exquisite complement to the slightly rare duck breast. Mona was moved to tears. The chartreuse was faultless. The orange, yellow, and green of the vegetables, a colorful tribute to the monks who first invented it, perfectly accented by the green and yellow of the crowns and the bright little bouquets scattered informally across the table. Seated around the candlelit table, the festive crowns of flowers and leaves gracing our heads like a company of Olympians, we toasted Agnes, lit the candles on the cake, and sang a joyous happy birthday. We devoured the cake and the tart afterward like a pack of ravenous wolves. Tuesday, August 11th. Letty wanted Agnes to see the beautiful chateau of Azay-le-Rideau, which she had visited on her honeymoon, and invited Jack and me to accompany them there. Azay-le-Rideau is not far from Savigny, and leaving the house by 11:30 that morning, we arrived in time for an early lunch at the Hotel Balzac on the outskirts of town. Once again, the food at this randomly chosen place was excellent, with a comfortable dining room that looked out onto a prim little garden of geraniums, clipped boxwood, and gravel. Agnes ordered a salad while the rest of us had full meals. I chose the lamb, and both Letty and Jack ordered the veal, each served with a nice little salad and a simple oil and vinegar dressing, roasted potatoes, green beans, some delicious bread, and a carafe each of a local red and white wine. The lamb was very good, but the veal was exceptional, served in a brown sauce made with white wine and shallots and seasoned with just a hint of thyme. For dessert, a delectable apricot tart was served with coffee. Unlike the other chateaux we visited with their symmetrical designs of long avenues and clipped parterres, Azay is in the English style, surrounded by an extensive park that after 2 centuries has come into an impressive maturity. At home, the symmetrical style is seldom undertaken, and to see it accomplished with such stunning effect in France, its place of origin, in all of its precision and clarity, had been a treat. But the park and garden here at Azay reminded me of the aesthetic pleasures of our own, more informal English-derived mode. The superb trees, wonderful specimens of ginkgo, cypress, and cedar, along with indigenous varieties, were a great refreshment on this very hot afternoon. We followed the gravel paths that move among them through numerous tree-framed views of this glorious palace, its image inverted in the surrounding lake that had been enlarged from the moat of a medieval fortification that once stood on this site. Inside, a galleried staircase of 3 flights divides the chateau down the center, so as you make your way from one end of each floor to the other, you repeatedly pass through this beautifully proportioned, dignified space cooled by the ventilation of the double windows that open on each landing. Such magnificence creates an illusion of stability. Immovable as the great stones of the foundation on which the whole improbable edifice is resting. The remorseless necessities of daily life would seem to have been banished here, but reviewing the historical sketch of its occupants, supplied in the brochure we'd received when purchasing our tickets, reminded me that you could find yourself as precariously perched in a chateau as in a hovel, that possessions and wealth, which free us from want, also incite rapacity and greed. The builder of the chateau, a finance minister to the king and lord to a handsomely endowed dame, had fallen under suspicion of corruption and beat an abrupt retreat into a distant country. Leaving his affluent wife and possessions in the dust, he escaped imprisonment and execution. The chateau had weathered the revolution, but impoverished after the collapse of the Second Empire, the descendants of those who had laid out the wonderful park had sold it piecemeal. You can't live in a palace and cut corners. The kitchens alone must have taken a dozen people to manage between the cooks and bakers and scullery. I stopped to admire an enormous quantity of copperware and fantasized about cooking in the huge open fireplace. But even in my daydreams, the work of feeding a castle full of people seemed staggering. Apart from the gentry and their constant house guests, there were the master's personal maids, servants for everyone else, groundskeepers and gamekeepers, not to mention the stable crowd. I'm thinking maybe Cinderella didn't get such a great deal after all. On the way back to the car, we passed a small grocery with a box in the window filled with what looked to be enormous pink grapes. Taken by their color and size, I went in to examine them and discovered that they were mirabelles, not large grapes at all, but ripe little plums. The grocer offered me one. It was so sweet and delicious that I purchased a bagful. which we ate on the ride home, saving a mere handful for our compatriots at the house. When we got back to Savigny, a traffic cop stopped us by the bridge for a long line of cars that was crossing the river out of the village. Waiting there in the intense heat, we became parched, and when Agnes raced into a cafe for a bottle of cold water, the bartender explained that there had been a funeral. At long last, we were allowed to proceed. Back at the house, Mackie told us he had run into the priest that morning who had given him the news. "Ah, a tragedy," he had said. "A young man, only 26. And then he mimed injecting a needle into his arm. The pitiful story seemed completely incongruous in this place. But we really didn't live here. We couldn't read the papers or understand the news on TV. We didn't have to find a job and a place to live. We really didn't know what life was for the average person. As we sat in our walled garden away from the stark, unhappy realities that can sometimes pull people apart, it seemed unfair to make a judgment. Despair has no boundaries. It just seemed more sorrowful given the happiness we had known in this place for the past month. Dinner, leftover mystery meat soup. For dinner, I made a soup by combining the trimmings left from the vegetable chartreuse with the remains of the mystery meat, a few cut-up carrots and onions, a half bottle of a cheap white wine with 6 cups of beef stock, and some fresh chopped tomatoes, all of which I let simmer for about an hour. There was about a cup of mashed potatoes left from the chartreuse that I mixed with 1 egg yolk and a couple of tablespoons of flour until it became just thick enough to roll into long strips. I cut the strips into 1-inch pieces like gnocchi, gave them a slight twist, and added them to the soup about 5 minutes before serving. It was a great meal despite the mystery meat, which mysteriously seemed tougher. I had begun to think it might be rhino or perhaps hippo. It wasn't until I had been home for several months and described the meat to a chef from France that I learned we had been eating wild boar and that the meat should have been braised, never grilled. Wednesday, August 12th. Agnes was leaving on an early train out of Tours that morning, and Letty, who was seeing her off at the station, offered to pick up the tickets for our own departure on Saturday. Remembering Madeline and Helmut's leave-taking, I suggested that we go first class. "This has been too wonderful a time to end up pushing and shoving to get in a crowded car," I said. "He's right," Mackie agreed without hesitation. "Get first class." As it turned out, because we were traveling as a group and with a minor, there was an enormous discount. Had I thought to remind Letty that I was over 60, we could have paid still less. Even so, subtracting the discounts, we paid only a few dollars more than for second class. That afternoon, Jack and I took our last walk out to the mill at Bélin, arriving once again at the nearby cafe just minutes after 2 o'clock. "Ferme!" the proprietor insisted without apology when I inquired about the plat du jour. Once again, we ordered baguette and sandwich hamon avec fromage, ham with for a change cheese. At a table nearby, a party sat laughing and joking, enjoying what looked like lovely food. I was more convinced than ever that the owner hated Americans. A little while afterward, his wife, who was apparently the cook, appeared with a tray full of beefsteak dinners served with French fries. The party, a crowd in their 50s and 60s who'd been drinking and were sharing a nice pâté, greeted her exuberantly. Setting a plate in front of each, she wished them bon appetit and disappeared without acknowledging us. Now I was convinced that not only the proprietor, but his wife as well, hated Americans. Still, it was pleasant sitting under the pavilion out of the heat. The other party was very entertaining. Not that we were eavesdropping. It was more like a French lesson. Recognizing an occasional word or phrase, we amused ourselves with wild guesses at what they might be saying. When it was time to pay the bill, I went inside. The owner muttered the amount. "I don't understand," I answered in my flawed French. The owner wrote the amount on a slip of paper. Studying it carefully, I felt pretty sure that it said 65 francs. So I laid out that amount, repeating it in French, as a question rather than as a statement. The mood suddenly reversing itself, the man repeated the amount, smiling. Once again, I repeated the amount. Attempting to correct my pronunciation, he again said, 65. This time I managed to reproduce the accent perfectly. And pleased by my effort, both of us smiled. "Merci, monsieur. Bon voyage," he said. "You know what?" I began as we headed back down the road to the river. "He doesn't hate Americans. I'll bet he thought we were English." "Why do you say that?" Jack asked. "Well, the French have never been crazy for the English. More generous than I," Jack suggested. "Maybe he's just tired of tourists. Remember how you felt about tourists when you had the restaurant? Although I appreciated the benevolence of this reasoning, I was still certain we had been mistaken for British. Before any of us left the house that morning, the fuel men had arrived to fill the oil tank for the hot water heater, and Mary Claire appeared with the key to the utility room. When the men had finished, they returned the keys, and Mary Claire, who was chatting with Mona and Letty, absent-mindedly set them on the table beside the set of house keys that Letty had taken down in preparation for her departure to tours. By this time, Jack and I had already gone, taking the second set of house keys with us. When Marie Claire left at the same time as everyone else, she offered to lock the gate after them as they drove away. When the group returned later that afternoon, they were mystified to discover that none of the keys would fit the gate. After much discussion, it was finally decided that they must have picked up the wrong set of keys and were locked out. Remembering a ladder stored in one of the caves, Mackie hoisted Rory up over the wall and into the garden. Hearing the commotion, the lady across the street came to her window, and when Letty explained the situation, she graciously supplied some chairs for the comfort of the sisters as they waited. By the time Rory returned and lowered the ladder down to his father, all of our elderly neighbors up and down Rue de la Liberté had appeared at their windows and doors to discuss the proceedings. Even Monsieur Dick barked an opinion from his accustomed perch. Shaking their heads, they watched the Americans climbing over the wall, laughing and saying things we weren't certain we wanted translated. Intermission. And we're back. Dinner. Cold sorrel vichyssoise. Rhubarb, plum, creme de cassé sauce on vanilla ice cream. We didn't want to leave a lot of food behind in the refrigerator, and with so little time remaining, decided to make do with what was left from our last trip to the ATAC. There were a few potatoes, a couple leeks, and some sorrel left in the garden. So I made a sorrel vichyssoise. First, I diced the potatoes, sautéing them with the leeks and butter until they were soft. I then added a cup of leftover Riesling from the refrigerator, letting it simmer for another 10 minutes before adding a quart and a half of fresh whole milk and about 4 cups of the chopped sorrel. Stirring continuously, I brought it to a boil, seasoned it with salt and pepper, turned it off, and poured it into a large baking dish that I put into the freezer to chill. Meanwhile, Mona had gathered a bunch of rhubarb from the garden. You know, she suggested it would really be nice to do something with this. We haven't used it once since we've been here. I diced it, about 3 cups, put it into a saucepan with a cup of sugar, a cup of plum jam, and a cup of creme de cassé, letting it simmer into a dark red sauce, sweet but just tart enough to make your mouth pucker. I set it aside to let it cool. When the soup was cold, I whipped it smooth in the blender and served it with baguettes and butter. For dessert, we had the rhubarb plum cassis sauce over vanilla ice cream. Later that evening, we were pleasantly surprised by a phone call from Madeline. It had taken her and Helmut all this time to feel that they had somehow readjusted to life stateside. The first week back, she grumbled, was dreadful. She hated everything, the bread, the butter, even the coffee. The flight back had been as lamentable as the flight over. And on their first morning, Helmut had announced that he, quote, wasn't getting out of bed until Buddy had made the coffee and gone down for baguettes, end of quote. I felt it was a great tribute. Thursday, August 13th. On the evening of our return from Paris, Mackie had talked with great enthusiasm about having visited Amboise, and in particular the Chateau La Cloche-Luce. the house where Leonardo da Vinci had spent the last 3 years of his life. To leave France without seeing this extraordinary residence would have been a great mistake, and over breakfast, Jack and I decided that it was a trip we would make that morning. With the coffee cups and dishes cleared away, we got into the car, waved goodbye, and headed out. At last, the long hot spell had broken. The sky was again a cloudlessly cool and dark blue. North of Tours, the road began following the Loire through a countryside less populated than the surrounding 7 years. With only an occasional farmhouse, the land appeared drier and flatter. People fished and camped at the edge of the broad river or waded in the cool water that never seemed more than waist deep. It was still early when we arrived at Amboise, parked the car, and headed up the long, narrow street to the top of the hill in the Chateau Le Clos-Luce. Francois, I had bestowed the house... Oh, excuse me. Francois I, not Francois I. Francois I had bestowed the house on Da Vinci with a yearly stipend of 700 golden crowns. He arrived in 1515 with Francesco de Melzi, his protege and companion, many years his junior, one servant, Battista de Villeneuve, and 3 paintings wrapped in leather bags and tied to a mule. St. John the Baptist, Virgin and Child with St. Anne, and incredibly, the Mona Lisa. The thought of him traveling from Italy to France carrying the Mona Lisa tied to a mule is stunning. The house was not yet crowded with visitors, and we were able to walk comfortably from room to room, standing before the bed where the great genius had died, touching the door handles he had once touched, feeling the stone of the fireplace of his room. We were humbled and inspired. From the windows of his study, we could view the great castle of his benefactor, Francois I, not far from where we stood. The Chateau Amboise, once the domain of splendor, also had a darker, more sinister history. In 1560, Protestants plotted to force religious concessions from Francois II, the son of Francois I, and Catherine de Medici. Upon learning of it, he had 1,200 of the conspirators slaughtered. As a warning to anyone who might want to reincite rebellion, he had the bodies hung from the castle and walls of the town, even suspending cadavers from trees throughout the city. The event was so horrifying that the reputation and power of the great castle created by his parents began slowly to erode and over the years disappeared completely. In the course of time, parts of the castle had even been dismantled. It was a bizarre irony standing in this room of so much vision and creativity, viewing the place that held such a fearful legend. I was eager to turn my back on this dreaded memorial in favor of the airiness that filled the halls that held the memory of Leonardo da Vinci. We strolled through the house, admiring the rooms, examining the frescoes painted by Leonardo's students in the small chapel, passing through the dining hall, until at last we arrived at the kitchen. We rested there for a long time. I studied the fireplace with its iron rings once used to hang game that were spit roasted and basted with hot wine. The bread bin, copper dishes, stone sink, and the long rough-hewn table all filled my imagination with thoughts of the food that must have been cooked there. The Mona Lisa in Italian is called La Gioconda. There is cake, attributed to the French, made of ground almonds, sugar, and egg yolks folded into a meringue and called a Joconde. It was named after the painting. I wondered if perhaps this was the very kitchen where it had been first concocted for the delight of the master. Throughout the rooms were framed quotations of Da Vinci. On a staircase leading to his workroom in the lower part of the house, I came across one entitled, On Work. The translation read, O God, you sell all things to men at the cost of their effort. For as long as I could remember, the fear that I would never succeed in my struggles, that I would never be good enough, had gripped me. But here, in this house of light, were the words from a man whose faith assured me that it was simply the effort that made me good enough. I felt, at long last, at the age of 61, released from that distant limbo of my childhood. We left the house, passing through the small Italianate garden at the rear, and then followed the path to the park that surrounded the house. Centuries-old trees lined the walks and shaded the grass where people sat eating sandwiches. A group of small children, led by a teenage girl, played a ring game in a clearing by the stream. Back in Souvenirs that afternoon, we accompanied Letty to the Marina Cafe for one last lunch. Beef steak with French fries served with a pâté and salad, a carafe of red wine, and for dessert, a prune and raisin tort. Letty complimented Madame on the cake, as we did on the entire lunch, and she offered to give her the recipe. I was surprised to see her bring a page from a magazine. I just assumed everything in France. Everyone in France was simply a wonderful cook by instinct. I couldn't imagine anyone using a recipe, creating one certainly, but using one. Je suis très amazed. But I found it to be such an interesting cake, I thought it should be shared. Farci Breton. 200 grams powdered sugar. 4 eggs. 3/4 liter milk. 250 grams flour. Spoonful of rum. Parentheses, the amount is up to the baker, end of parentheses. 50 grams raisins. 12 pitted prunes. Whip together the sugar, eggs, milk, flour, and rum. Add the prunes and raisins. Put the mixture into a buttered cake pan and bake at 325 degrees Fahrenheit for about an hour. After lunch, I set off on a final walk out to the sunflowers, stopping once again to admire the stone farmhouse that sits by the river where the road turns abruptly back into the yellow fields behind. The wonderful blue-green front door that faces out toward the river stands above stone steps, covered in masses of deep green moss. A magenta hydrangea was blooming against the light gray of the limestone wall. The combination of the color and form was also beautiful that I determined I must return and photograph it. As I turned the corner, my attention was caught by a massive shrub of lavender that grew in a little bit of yard behind the house. Then I looked up in anticipation of the great yellow sunflowers and was completely taken aback. The entire field had turned gray. The heads drooped as though in a great sadness, which I imagined was for me, because I was leaving. Thanking them for this gesture of commiseration, I bade them an affectionate au revoir, touched by their show of friendship at my impending departure. Gorgeous. Dinner. Cream of leek soup, salad, cream caramel. In the refrigerator, there were still a dozen or so petite Suisses, a couple of creme and cafe caramels in their little glass jars, several hunks of unfinished cheese, almost all of the goat honey, a few chocolate bars, some white wine and champagne, and a handful of carrots, tomatoes, and string beans. I gathered up the last of the leeks from the garden. In a soup pot, I melted a cup of butter and stirred in about a cup of flour and a half cup of dry chicken bouillon. When the flour, butter, and bouillon were thoroughly mixed, I added half a bottle of white wine and let the soup simmer until the alcohol had cooked off. Then I added a quart of milk. As the mixture thickened on the heat, I added the washed and chopped leeks, seasoned the mix with black pepper and salt, and let it simmer on a low flame until it developed into a creamy leek soup. With it, I served the cheese, leftover bread, and a salad of carrots, tomatoes, lettuce, and string beans. We had the creme caramels for dessert. Friday, August 14th. This was to be our last full day at the house, and my walk to the patisserie seemed very important this morning. I looked around at the town as if to fix in my mind forever the bike shop, the markets, the bakeries, the tables overlooking the river where we had enjoyed so many pleasant meals together. I felt as though I had lived here a long time, long enough for people to recognize me, to smile and wish me bonjour when we met, long enough to feel comfortable and safe here. The house and the town seemed to have become our own. Tomorrow there wouldn't be time enough for our usual leisurely breakfast. We would be leaving too early for the station. I tried not to dwell on our impending departure as I made the coffee and heated the water for tea, setting the table with the beautiful blue and white china and the small coffee mugs with the convenient little lip on the ear for your thumb. After breakfast, Jack and I decided to make a final trip into tours. There had been a fine press edition offered by the museum as a souvenir of the Delacroix exhibition we had attended of the small bound sketchbook the artist had kept of the terrain. At the time, the price had seemed exorbitant, but since then, Jack had regretted his decision to forego the purchase, and I suggested this would be the last opportunity for him to obtain the book. Learning of our plans, Letty decided to make one last foray into the lace and drapery shops and joined us. We parked the car near a favorite corner cafe and, agreeing to meet there in a couple of hours for lunch, left on our separate ways. The young lady at the front desk of the museum shook her head and, with a delicate gesture of regret, indicated that none of the Delacroix sketchbooks were left. In her somewhat faltering English, she explained that a new order was expected by the end of the week. When I told her that we were leaving in the morning, she invited us to take a seat and, excusing herself for a moment, began dialing her phone. There followed a rapid exchange, repeated in a second phone call, after which she smiled in our direction. "Voila," she said, inviting us back to the desk. There was a store nearby, she explained, with the book in stock. Taking a pocket-sized street map from a drawer, she marked an X on the museum and traced a line along the streets we were to follow, marking our destination with another X and printing the name of the store at one corner of the map. We were very taken by her thoughtfulness and, following her directions, were able to find the bookstore without any difficulty. By this time it was nearing noon, and on our way to the cafe where we had agreed to meet Letty, we passed what at first appeared to be a patisserie. The window was filled with the most beautiful confections I had ever seen. I couldn't help but stop to admire the display of remarkable pastries that were really small pieces of edible art, tiny fruit tarts filled with strawberries and peach slices, kiwi and bananas, raspberries and mirabelles, little meringue swans, puff pastry filled with cremes and custards of different flavors, miniature cakes decorated more elaborately than any wedding cake, chocolate-covered creams and nuts and divinely ornate truffles. Inside, the showcases displayed a luncheon buffet. There were tapas, little Spanish meat pies folded in half, about the size of a silver dollar. There were 2 beautifully conceived terrines, one spinach, a long green loaf, filled with orange pieces of carrots, the other fish, alabaster white, artfully infused with a combination of tomatoes, carrots, and mushrooms. There were thinly sliced baked eggplant wrapped around little sausages and a tart of a butter pastry, filled with sun-dried tomatoes. A hostess invited me to be seated, but I replied that I was simply admiring the magnificent turnout. When I explained that I was a chef, she invited me to see the rest of the buffet on the upper level. There I found more of the same and a masterful display of breads. "Look," I said, after Jack and I had found Letty, who was just about to order a cool drink. "I found this incredible place. We must eat there." Both Jack and Letty were concerned about the price. "I'll treat," I insisted, refusing to accept a no. "We have to eat there." Letty gathered up her bags and we headed back to the restaurant. Seeming pleased, the hostess welcomed me back, led us up the stairs to a table on the mezzanine, and handed us each a menu. Pour tours. Semaine des gourmets plats à emporter. Et service au buffet. Pâtissière, chocolatière, traitière. Inside it listed buffet d'entrées, salade de concombre, tartare de légumes aux fines herbes, tarte à basilic, tomates et poivrons, tapas d'aubergine à l'andalou, terrine de la mer à la coriandre, salad piemontaise. A waitress appeared with carafes of red and white wine, wearing just a touch of makeup, dressed in a white blouse and blue, mid-length skirt with slits in the side. She had a naturalness about her that put us entirely at ease. Throughout the meal that followed, her service never had that strained effort to be elegant that comes across as contrived and ends up making the diner feel uncomfortable. This was a woman who had the gift of making you feel gladly received. I helped myself to the empanada, filled little pastries and a sweet sour sauce, some of the spicy veal sausages wrapped in eggplant, a slice of the sun-dried tomato tart, and a thin slice each of the spinach and whitefish terrines. Shamelessly, I was about to go for a second helping when the waitress arrived with a tray filled with 3 dishes of steaming food. "What's this, Letty?" I asked. After a short exchange with the waitress, Letty explained. "Panache de la mer. Petits légumes frais." With the buffet, you also get the entree. And I think because today is Friday, it's fish. There were 3 kinds of fish and a light cream sauce, a smoked whitefish, a perch, and the third, which looked and tasted like sole. The sauce was excellent. The sauce was excellent. On one side of the plate was creamed cauliflower, and on the other side was cauliflower not creamed, which seemed odd, but I liked the idea a lot. This chef really knew his business. His taste was flawless. Wanting him to know how much he had been appreciated, I sent the menu down with the waitress and asked her if she would have the chef autograph it.